Jen Stout, thank you very much for being a guest today.
My pleasure.
As always, I've been given my Inside the Actor Studio questionnaire. Um, what is your favorite word?
My favourite word. I have quite a few Shetland favourite words that a lot of people probably won't know what they mean. But let's go for a general Scottish one. I think smur is a very good word. It's a kind of rain.
What is your least favorite word?
Reach out in any email. Stop it.
What is your favorite swear word?
It begins with a C, and I won't say it.
What's your favorite Ukrainian or Russian swear word?
Bliat.
That was also Christopher Miller's one. What is a sound or noise that you love?
Curlews.
What is a sound or noise that you hate?
Beeping.
Do you have any guilty pleasures?
Repeats of Frasier.
Nice. I'm also a big Frasier fan. Do you any particular favorite episode?
The sort of perfect physical comedy, Chaplin-esque, where Niles is trying to iron his tie or something.
My go-to is usually Voyage of the Damned,
Yeah.
where they're on the cruise to Alaska.
Yeah.
What is your favorite book?
The Island by Aldous Huxley.
Finally, are there any fictional characters who you'd like to imagine yourself to be?
Generally pirates. Hmm.
Any particular ones?
There's a sort of young adult pirates series with like young women who run the ship and are fighting these fascists, and yeah, I'd lead that brigade, and that'd be great fun.
So you just got back from Ukraine. And I thought I'd begin by asking sort of where in the country did you tour and how was it?
Yeah, it was quite a brief visit, sadly. I was there mostly to go to Mykolaiv and to work in the region around Mykolaiv, observing the work of deminers with the Mines Advisory Group. So, as you know, getting to Ukraine, like the travel is a lot, particularly from Scotland. So it was kind of 3 days of travel for 3 days there. I had a couple of nights in Kiev, and then it was just, you're sitting in cars for 8 hours a day or sitting at the border for hours for no reason. Lots and lots of very long trains. But it was worth it just to be there for a bit because, man, it's so beautiful down there. I spent a lot of time in the east of Ukraine is a place that I deeply, deeply love. But I spent a lot of time in the kind of northeast, so like Kharkiv region and the north of Donetsk Oblast. And the landscape there is kind of rolling, misty, forested hills. It was incredibly beautiful, and the white chalk hills and escarpments around Sviatogirsk, for instance. This was down, 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 and then I spent a bit of time in like Kurakova and places which sadly we can't go now, where it becomes the steppe and it's kind of mining villages and pit heads and collieries. And I love this landscape too. But this was proper steppe. This was like, it's so flat. It's so flat. And the nature is so incredible. I'm from the furthest north in Scotland, from a very small island. And like, for us, it's just when things grow above the ground, it's really quite amazing. And everything grows there. Do you know, it's really, really hot. You've got these fields and fields of sunflowers and barley and wheat, except of course where there's been too much UXO, too much threat of mines being laid, and so those fields are laying fallow, and that's what they're trying to do, get rid of them.
I have yet to visit Ukraine, but from everything I've read and from everything I've seen, I think one of the things that sort of keeps striking me is the scale of everything compared to
Hmm.
Britain. Of you could probably see across a river in Britain, and could probably easily swim it, and yet something like in Ukraine, just these vast, huge rivers.
It's a huge country, and people don't realize that, and it would be a lot more difficult to get around. But they have a functioning rail network, which we do not. So Ukrzaliznytsia, the company which runs the trains in Ukraine, are wonderful, absolutely wonderful. They've been building their own new carriages. Can you imagine? I mean, when was the last time we did that in Britain? Like the 70s? They build new carriages, and they've like kitted them out to be sort of accessible for people in wheelchairs. They've made more of the Platzkart, so the sort of third class open carriage, really cheap, really functional, just really, really useful. You get to lie down, you get bed linen, you get tea. Do you know? Can you imagine doing that in this country? So for a freelancer, like as I was traveling around Ukraine an awful lot in the last few years, I couldn't have done that without that train network. It's amazing.
One thing I loved about Night Train to Odessa is the the conductors on these trains, and I think you say to one how grateful you are to be on these trains, and they're just like can't understand it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them feel. One of them I was speaking to is a very young guy, and he felt very much that this was his kind of his war effort, and I agree with him. Yeah, and I told him actually about because that train I think was a few minutes. It was maybe like 10 minutes delayed because of shelling, right? And I was like, that's fine, I understand, you know. And I said, listen, mate, do you know? And I was trying to explain in Russian to him actually at the time what it's like in the UK, and he genuinely wouldn't believe me.
Um, I think you were also in Ukraine during Russia's aerial bombardment recently. Russia's been launching hundreds and hundreds of
Hmm.
drones and missiles. Did you experience it at all?
A little bit in Kiev, yeah. I have this strange blessing where, and this has been going on for years. When I'm driving towards a city or on a train going towards a city, it'll be hit, and when I get there, it's suddenly quiet. And it was the same. It was the same this time. So every night I was in Kiev, there was a little bit of anti-aircraft stuff, a couple of drones one night, but really nothing like they've been experiencing. And then as soon as I left, it started again. And the same in Mykolaiv. It was absolutely peaceful quiet every single night in Mykolaiv when I was there. Once I left, then I think they hit the Privat Bank in the middle of town, you know, quite near where I was staying, and of course it just started again. So, yes, a strange sort of divine intervention going on here, which I'm grateful for. But frankly, as a journalist, it's fairly annoying.
Are you worried that like towns might try and keep you there just to
Yeah, so good omen. Yeah, I mean, look, it's not always borne true. There's been quite a lot of shelling in Kharkiv when I was there with the glide bombs, and in places like Siversky, you know, there was a lot of hairy moments. But yes, I mean I could get a sense of how bad it's been just by talking to my friends in Kiev and how knackered they are and how pissed off they are because they're, you know, a lot of people don't go to the shelter. You get used to this stuff and you figure out what kind of threat it is. And but this time, the last few weeks, they've all been down in the metro, like not bothering with like a little crumbly basement, but like into the metro and sleeping there. And they're obviously exhausted.
I read an interesting piece in the Kyiv Independent about a writer talking about I think her name is Elsa Court that with these like aerial bombardments, Russia isn't only trying to cause death and destruction, it's also like overloading your senses with sound. Um,
Yeah, my friend in Kharkiv, Natalia Zuba, she calls it acoustic terror. You know, the point is to drive you mad and make you scared. It doesn't work because they're Ukrainian, right? But of course of course it has a terrible impact on your health and your nervous system. I find Ukrainians have a much more holistic understanding of health and the mind and the body, like much more than we do. So a lot of people would use the kind of analogy of like the whole body. The whole body can't sort of withstand, the nervous system cannot withstand this sort of constant pressure, which, yeah, it's something that we would find hard to imagine here in our utter safety and peace.
so I thought I'd begin by sort of asking what drew you to Russia and Eastern Europe?
I grew up in Shetland, which is an archipelago in the north between Scotland and Norway. And we are considered by people in the south to be very remote, but we always say remote from what? From London, who cares? I need to go there anyway. And we used to be the centre of, you know, a very intricate and far-reaching seafaring network, of course. And it's very normal there to go away to and to speak other languages. We're a very kind of outward-looking internationalist, cosmopolitan people, I think. And so when I was growing up, you could do Russian in the school, and it was one teacher who just changed my whole life. She was amazing. She kind of gave a shit, you know, which wasn't the vibe at the time, I have to say, in my school. She was great. She changed my whole life just through encouragement. I liked Russian a lot. I was able to learn it really. She said I soaked it up like a sponge. And at that point, I was like a really grumpy teenager. I didn't go to school very much. And I tried German and French, but I was just, I mean, I refused to learn French because it was illogical. So that gives a sense of just quite how difficult and bullshit I was. But yeah, Russian, I really understood. It was like I spoke it in a past life, which I didn't. But I learned that. She took us to St. Petersburg when I was 15, which was just mind-blowing, of course. You know, I'd not really been abroad. And I went off to uni to do Russian sociology. well, Russian in the beginning, but then they made you pay for your year abroad, and I didn't have any money because I'm from a croft, so I had to drop that. And thanks Edinburgh University, that bit of elitism, and I just did sociology in the end. But my whole aim was to try and be a correspondent in Eastern Europe, and I was already interested in Ukraine as well at the time. I went on a trip there, a holiday in November to Kharkiv by myself, as soon as I had a job and enough money to do so. So it's always had this huge appeal to me. I feel very at home in that part of but not in Russia. Let's just be clear, because no one could feel at home in that stifling fascistic environment. But I mean, in Eastern Europe, particularly in Ukraine, I feel very at home. But yeah, my sort of journey of trying to become a correspondent was not the easiest, because if you don't have basically rich parents and all the connections and the unpaid internships, I mean, it's just incredibly unmeritocratic. And you can tell that because when you go into newsrooms or speak to people who do these jobs, do you know do you know what accent they all have?
I'm guessing uh, received pronunciation.
Oh, hi. I'm Olivia. Are you all called Olivia? Like all of it's. I'm generalising here, obviously, and some of them are lovely, but it is incredibly noticeable. And I think particularly for foreign reporting, because I would listen to all these, all these interviews of people who do the kind of these dream jobs, and so many times they would say, "Oh, I mean, I just went. When I was just 20, I just went." Right, and you're like, "How did you? How did you do that? How did you just go? What?" Because I was like working in bars just to pay the rent, like all of my 20s,
I
doing
mean, it's
multiple
like
different jobs.
it's like those sort of stories you see in the Telegraph of like, I bought a house just by not buying avocado, and
Yeah,
like a little tiny bit of the story, they also received 100 grand from their parents to buy the house.
yeah. No, I think very much. I mean, Britain's a very sort of class divided, rigid place, I think, and you see that particularly in the opportunities that people get. So yes, it was tricky. I'd read a lot of Anna Politkovskaya in school, and so I really wanted to be a sort of investigative slash war journalist. I really found that for some reason very appealing, um, despite what happened to her. And it took me a long time, it took me a long time. But eventually, I mean, I became a journalist, doing a kind of 6 month fast track NCTJ, where you do your shorthand and law. I did that at Liverpool Community College because it was the cheapest place to do it.
But
And also,
I'm based in Liverpool, so
right, yeah, it's a great city. Had a great time. Still had to work in bars quite a lot, but had a great time. And then I went to work in a local paper in Stranraer, and that teaches you everything. Do you know, it's very, very intense. And then I went to the BBC and I worked in TV, and which was drove me insane. And then I worked in radio in Shetland, and then I got on this placement to go to Moscow for a year. And it was just way too late to be going off to Moscow thinking I could do some kind of journalism. Like it was way too late for any of that stuff. And it was the worst few months of my life.
well, I mean, one of my questions was going to be, did you envision becoming a war reporter, or was it just that the area of the world where you were interested in suddenly became consumed by war?
Do you know, sometimes it's hard, it's difficult. I don't know if you find this. I find it difficult to look back and remember what I thought about what I was going to do. So, I could say like, oh no, I just wanted to be a journalist and a correspondent. I didn't have I wasn't on a mission to be in wars. And then, of course, that part of the world that I have a lot of expertise in and language skills in, there happened to be, I found myself right in the middle of this whole thing. I'm not sure that'd be entirely truthful. So I read, I'm trying to find her. Martha Gellhorn's there somewhere, and I read a lot of Martha Gellhorn, and in my 20s and 30s, and John Steinbeck's book about World War II. I loved that kind of direct, non-judgmental reporting that made you feel like you were there, in contrast perhaps to Hemingway's reporting, which was mostly made up and incredibly self-aggrandizing, but sadly he's no better than Gellhorn. And I felt like, when you have that feeling in your stomach, that kind of gut feeling that there's something that you should be doing, you'd be really good at it, and no one will really believe you because it's a crazy, stupid thing to do, but you're just going to have to go with it and try and trust your gut. And that's kind of what it was like when I left Moscow, was this thing of like, what if I just go? Just go. And as ever, I had no money, and it wasn't the easiest route, but I went to Romania first, and then into Ukraine. And yeah, I mean, I'd always wanted to be in the middle of things, shall we say. Doesn't necessarily have to be a conflict, but even those first few weeks on the border, to be in the middle of the biggest story in the world, it felt very historic. I felt really, really lucky to be there, and I felt like I could help. I had the knowledge and the skills to explain what was going on to people with context, with history, and also like trying to write as beautifully as possible. That was kind of the aim.
You kind of touched on this already, but something that interested me in night train to Odessa is, for want of a better phrase, the sort of the economics of being a reporter and like getting funding for the training, how to fund towards Ukraine, which stories or which mediums to focus on. And I find that really interesting.
Yeah, it's. I think that we're relying more and more on freelancers and stringers because of all the budget cuts in newsrooms. And that's good in a sense because there's these opportunities for people like me to sort of get a foot in the door and get some work and prove yourself and make a name for yourself and all that. It's also bad because they pay us so little in general. I mean, I worked a bit for the Sunday Post. I was freelance for them, and they were great. They were really decent. But some of the big name papers, and I mean the big London papers, the rates that they offer people on the ground on the border at that time in Ukraine also are absolutely outrageous. They are disgusting, and they do it because they can, and they also do it because there's a lot of like inexperienced and, shall we say, perhaps rich kids who they can't just go, and they can accept very, very low rates. And as any industry, that drives it all down and makes it even crapper. So yeah, the finances of it are a horror show, and I think people would be absolutely amazed to learn what we earn in general. I do more kind of long form stuff now, which is a bit better paid and a bit more enjoyable than the kind of breaking news grind. But yeah, I mean, I left Russia really, really quickly, didn't have any money, and it was because I met all these volunteers who, I remember at that time there was this real sense of solidarity, like these huge networks across Europe, people helping each other out. So I knew someone in Romania, they said, oh, if you can get to this place, you can get a lift with this guy. And it was kind of, you had to have very little luggage and be willing to jump in a van at the last minute's notice. And I'm fine with that. Like, I don't mind traveling like that at all. You get the most interesting chats and you end up in very interesting places. And then just the pitching, the pitching and pitching and pitching and pitching, and it's slightly soul crushing because I'd rather be out there talking to people. But I was getting to do that. So when I was at this port in the south east of Romania, I was spending up most of the days at the port interviewing people who were coming across from Odessa, from Mykolaiv, some of them from Mariupol even, and then I would go and write this all up, and I would do sort of live radio, and I'd make myself available generally. And that's a big part of being a stringer, is that you need to pick up the phone. You need to be on the ground, and you need to be on the ground in a place where the big guys are not. So the BBC might take some lives if, I don't mean London BBC, but like other parts of BBC Scotland, other parts of the World Service, if they don't have anyone at that spot. And because I do radio, print, photos, I did a bit of TV, video, but honestly, it's such a faff. It's just not worth it at all, in my opinion. And I don't like putting cameras in people's faces when they're really upset. It kind of chips away at my soul too much. But yeah, you need to be doing everything all the time. I don't think that's good, but that's how the industry is.
Something that Christopher Miller talked about is his approach to his sort of strategy in reporting. Is sort of he described it as he zags when others zig. And so I'm kind of curious about what's your strategy for choosing stories and what to focus on versus where, like, as you said, like the big players are versus smaller, more interesting stories.
Over the last few years, I suppose, in Ukraine, one of the benefits for me was that I had to just go with the flow. And that means, like, for instance, I met some guys from Penn, Ukraine. And then a few days later, they said, oh, we're going on this trip, with a bunch of people to places that are just deoccupied. These are quite hard to get into if you're just on your own, particularly if you're freelance. And because I was with them, then I could tag along. And that means being like, right, I've no idea where we're going. Oh, I need to be at this metro station at 8 a.m. With some stuff. And you just have to go like that. So it's very different, I suppose, to the way that the bigger or sort of staff reporters would be working, which is you have a team, you have fixers, you have producers breathing down your neck wanting to know what you're doing. Whereas when I'm freelance, I'll just be like, hey, I might write this, I might go here. I don't know what will happen there. And they're like, yeah, sure. And that's because they're not paying my insurance. They're not, they're not responsible for me. I'm responsible for me. There are a lot of downsides to that. I've just been lucky in that I haven't been hurt. But yeah, it does make you very, very free. Very, very free. And I suppose I focus on things that really interest me. So I am very interested in the context of colonialism in this story, and that context in Kharkiv in the 1920s with the murder of the writers and artists and playwrights in Slovo House. I'm interested in all these traces of Russian imperialism in that country. I'm interested in what it means now for people switching language. And these are stories where, yeah, I need to go and talk to a lot of people and take my time doing it, but I also need to maybe spend like 3 days literally just reading so that I can make my reporting better and make sure I understand the history and the context better and do interviews around that rather than kind of what's immediately happening in front of us. Again, that's a great luxury that you couldn't do if you were having to do like lives and TV packs and stuff. You just don't have time for that. So yeah, I like the zig and the zag idea. That's good. I think the thing I'd remind people is that for, particularly with the pitching stuff, for every story that we manage to do, there are so many that never come to fruition, because you can't get access, because it falls apart at the last minute, because the editor, something else happens and the editors aren't interested. And it's, a lot goes on behind the scenes, which is just us sitting in like not very nice hotel rooms on our laptops, getting terrible neck pain and swearing.
I mean, one of my favorite stories in Night Train to Odessa was the Jeeps for Peace,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of following a jeep from like a farm in Aberdeenshire all the way to the front line.
Well, driving it, yeah. Yeah. I tried to put in humour into the book because I want it to be readable and because life is often very funny, and often in the most like extreme circumstances life is very funny, and people use humor a lot. And there's a lot of humorous things that happen when a bunch of people try to drive a convoy of clapped out old farm pickups 1,600 miles across the European continent. Those things are going to break down. And they did, dramatically. um yeah, I mean, for me that was a no-brainer. Like, I hate flying, and I love driving, so like when they said, oh, do you want to come along, I was like, obviously, or probably I nagged them to come along in retrospect. Yeah.
There's another point you make that I thought was interesting, sort of on that, of uh, news editors would want stories about Ukrainians being sort of scared or helpless, but actually you would find them just being like unrelentingly optimistic or resilient or sort of darkly humorous.
Say darkly humorous most of all. Like, there was, like, in the beginning, of course, there was that kind of giddy hope, particularly after the counteroffensive in 22, when Ukraine took back so much land. That is, you can't, that's not sustainable. You can't live with that kind of hope, and you wouldn't find it now at all, in my experience. But people have a sort of longer term grim commitment because, of course, it's existential and they don't really have any choice. But yeah, in terms of what editors expect, and I think sometimes people have thought I meant there's some sort of conspiracy about this, that they want you to change the reality to fit some kind of sort of tawdry reader expectation, or readers desiring it to be all sort of tears and misery. And the point I wanted to make is, of course, there was that. I mean, people have been through terrible things and they would often cry when they were talking to me, and I would describe that. But they'd also then come out with like the most beautiful swearing about Putin. And I thought that was important to include because, like, they have agency. And it's like, if we were in their position, imagine you've had a nice life and you never thought you'd end up like dragging a shopping bag over a border with absolutely no idea where you're going to go, and suddenly people are referring to you as a refugee and treating you in this really, like, oh, poor you, it must be so awful. And people kind of bristle at that, right? They don't like that because it strips them of their agency. So I think people being very, like, the eloquent swearing about Putin is very heartfelt, very funny. Uh, but I think there's a lot of interesting kind of psychology in it as well.
Whenever I sort of get into an argument, which I try to avoid, but an argument with anyone, say, sort of on the right, who will complain about sort of asylum seekers, I often make the point that we're very fortunate that we haven't yet experienced something that would make us asylum seekers. like the way people in Ukraine probably never expected that they would be under this kind
Hmm.
of conflict and experiencing this kind of like um, sort of terror.
Yeah, I try and do that, but like honestly, I don't know how you make people imagine things that neither they nor their parents nor their grandparents have ever had to thought about. It's I think it's almost impossible actually. We don't know we're born in this country. Do you know? We just and we don't know how much danger we're in. We've got no air defenses left. Do you know?
Mm.
I mean, it's one of the most difficult things to like kind of live in two worlds at the same time because I do try and live here for some reason. And going between Ukraine, where I find people to be much more pragmatic and sensible about what's happening in the world, and here, where people are kind of apathetic, cynical, living in la la land, it's difficult not to get cross at people, but it's also kind of pointless.
I mean, several months ago, I interviewed the defense analyst, Kia Giles, and he's written a very excoriating book called "Who Will Defend Europe?"
Yeah,
And one of his points is that like Britain, like if Russia did decide to attack Britain, uh, Britain's defenses are so moribund from the air, from the sea, that
yeah,
like British people don't fully appreciate the extent how vulnerable we are as a country.
sure. I mean, we're an island. It's been a very long time since we're invaded. Again, I'm not sure how you persuade people of that. In like the people who understand it are freaking out, but most people don't. They think you're being very alarmist or hysterical or kind of a NATO shill. But yeah, I mean, we people got into that position because we were just like, oh, it's NATO, it's America, it's fine. We're fine. We're under the umbrella, the great umbrella. Yeah, how's that working out?
Um, so you kind of touched on this, but with the sort of Russian colonial aspect with Ukraine, um, Night Train to Odessa starts with you in sort of Moscow on the eve of the invasion, and you talk about the sort of the weird mix of like cynicism and denialism about invading Ukraine. And so I'm curious about what was it like being in that environment on the eve of the invasion?
Not great. Yeah, no, I honestly, every day a little part of me just takes a second to feel thankful that I'm not in Moscow anymore. I'd rather be in the worst bit of Donbass, because it's free. Yeah, it was incredibly surreal to be watching this happening like on our phones and the news and seeing Western news about the troop build-up, talking to friends in Kharkiv who were right next to this troop build-up, and then people around you just being like, "Oh, it's all hype, it's all Western nonsense." It was very difficult to know what to do next. When I mean, the eve of the invasion, I actually left Moscow for an overnight flight to Siberia, to the very heart of the continent in Gorno-Altaysk, and this was a program trip that we kind of had to do. I wasn't think it was just the best idea, but off we went. And look, it's hard to remember like precisely the frame of mind. I tried to look through all my messages and stuff when I was writing the book to get an idea of what I was saying to people and what they were saying to me. And I, like so many people, I didn't think they would do a full scale invasion of Ukraine, not because I think they're nice, but because I thought they weren't stupid. I thought they would maybe do a further incursion into the east. And so I was really shocked when I got off this plane, turned on my phone, and we're standing in this kind of white expanse of snow and mountains and getting these messages from friends in Kharkiv saying they're bombing us with jet planes. And just spending a few days there in this kind of absolute surreal ball of fury, basically, trying not to hit people. Um, and then we left, very quickly and left the country. And I was very, very happy to do so. I think, I mean, obviously, it wasn't just that time. Obviously, this kind of denial and this insanity that has descended in Russia has been going on for many, many years. Peter Pomerantsev describes it very well. That phrase, nothing is true and everything is possible. And it is that kind of, people would say to me, well, you have your truth and we have ours. And then, then we're screwed. Then you can do anything. You can commit genocide if that's your line. Because what is it true? Is it not true? It doesn't matter. It's just the way that you twist things. It's the way that you view things. And there's a kind of cynicism in that is depthless and that I find really scary. And I think a lot of that has to do with Soviet times and how people would survive in that system by believing different truths at the same time, and being very, very cynical about the states and about their ability to affect it. And I think that when that set takes hold in a society, terrible things can happen and are happening. And there's also this huge aspect of kind of defensiveness, humiliation from the 1990s in particular, some of which I can understand. But yeah, this desire to be great, desire to be proud and great again. And they had to go all the way back to World War II to find something to be really proud of, you know, and then try and, I mean, the Russian motto about World War II was, we can repeat. So here we are repeating. I don't know why anyone's so surprised.
I mean, my second guest on the podcast last year was the historian Anna Reid. And something I talked to her about is this sort of amusing, kind of terrifying thing Russia does with Ukraine, which is basically they will often accuse Ukraine of doing things historically that Russia has done on a much bigger scale. So, like, they will talk about Ukrainians collaborating with the Nazis, but then they don't mention the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
and then sort of Ukrainians acquiescing to the Holocaust, but then no talk of, say, Stalin's genocidal actions or the Ukrainian famine or anything like that.
Yeah, it's a very effective tactic. Whataboutery. Honestly, like the number of times when I was in Moscow that people would say to me, "You invaded Iraq, right?" And I'd be like, "Did I?" Sort of marched against it actually, but they were just trying to goad me. They were trying to get a rise. And you get the same conversations in Serbia. It's that same kind of defensiveness because they know deep down they've done some really dark shit that they shouldn't have done. And lots of people, that I'm not saying it's just Russia. Like all of, you could say the same about things that Britain did in World War II. With firebombing, you say the same about, yes, of course, collaboration all over Eastern Europe. The picture of the war, Second World War in that part of the world is very, very complicated, and a lot of people did some very bad shit. And
No,
it's difficult now because there's never been this kind of open discussion about it. And also the way that we talk about the Second World War still is very much just about Western Europe. And so it's very easy for historical narratives, like you mentioned, these historical kind of lies to get twisted around and put out by Russia as like proof that they alone, because that's the big thing, they alone fought fascism. And actually, when you talk to a lot of Russians, they can't tell you what fascism is because they're not taught about this in school. What they're taught in school is that the war began in 1941. because before that, of course, nothing happened, like as you say, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And so they can't. Fascist became this word that they would use to throw at anybody who was just against the Soviet Union. So like partisans in Belarus, partisans in Estonia, whatever, people who didn't want to be under this empire, they were all fascists. And it's just this: if you're against us, you're a fascist. And so they can't see that they've actually become that thing themselves. It's tragedy on such a huge scale.
And something that Anna Reid and I talked about was like a key difference in places like Eastern Europe, where there is this more sort of complicated relationship with, say, the Second World War, is the extent to which a country and its people process that history. So, like, Ukrainians process and talk about and explore their history with, say, the Jewish population in Ukraine, whereas Russia doesn't process that history. It actively suppresses. And I think she mentioned an example of a Russian academic who used to work on MVKD concentration camps, but now she's shifted her academic focus to fisheries in like northern Siberia.
Yeah. No, that period of openness in Russia is, I mean, it wasn't full openness, but that's finished. That's finished now. They're building statues to Stalin. Memorial is finished. That's all done now. I mean, is any country really good at examining their past? We used to think that Germany was, but I'm honestly not so sure. The more I learn about German society now, there are lots of uncomfortable truths, lots of difficult things that don't fit into a neat and easy narrative, massively. And you mentioned Anna Reid. Actually, I'm reading her. Oh, I got it next to me. I'm reading her book, Nasty Little War. Who knew that that Britain and lots of Western European countries went into Russia to try and stop the Bolshevik revolution, and in doing so, I mean, created an almighty mess. Didn't really achieve anything, but also, I mean, we're collaborating with white forces, and all sides were pogroming all over the place, right? Like there are no goodies in that story. And no wonder it's not really been discussed widely, but I'd really recommend people read that book, like all of Anna's books. It's really, really good.
I
And I
mean,
will actually be, I'm so excited about this, I will be appearing alongside Anna Reid at the Hereford Military History Festival in September, talking about Ukraine, which will be so exciting. So please do come, people around there.
um, I mean, she made the great point that like I think she makes it in the book as well, and we talked about it a bit, which is the Russian civil war is very difficult for Putin because does he side with losers or side with revolutionaries? And because ideologically, the White Russians are probably closer to his worldview than the Bolsheviks, and I think he repatriated some of the
Yes.
bodies. Uh,
Yes, right. But this is where it gets so. I think Anna mentioned this, but this is where it gets just so absurd. So if you look at the people who were drawn to the Russian occupied part of Donbass and Luhansk, Donetsk and Luhansk, in recent years to like volunteer as fighters, they're fascists. They're Confederate style fascists. They're Rune and Wolf style fascists. They're all the different fascists, and there were elements, I would argue, of fascism in the Bolsheviks and what they did, and their bloodlust and utter control of the population. Of course, there were elements of fascism in the white side massively, and that kind of Tsarist glory to the Tsar and all that stuff, massively fascist as well. So he just picks the bits of history that look strong. Of course, a big one of that now is Stalin. Very fascist, very, very fascist. I don't know why anyone finds this like I'm on the left. I always will be, and I always have been. And I think generally, it's so easy for me to see that massive elements of that were absolutely fascist and nothing that I would ever be a cheerleader for. And I find it extraordinary that people do. So yeah, Putin just picks the bits that are the strongest.
Something I thought you conveyed really well in Night Train to Odessa is, and as you talk about, not the divided loyalties of some Ukrainians towards Russia, but just like a deep feeling of like hurt and betrayal.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's one bit where I think an older Ukrainian woman at a dinner party in Odessa who just like asked for everyone to change the conversation because it was just it was almost a familial betrayal and better to they recognize it. They know Russia's doing it. They hate Russia for doing it, but also the pain is just like so deep emotionally.
Yeah, it's absolutely a familial betrayal. I mean, literally, she was talking about the Russian relatives and saying, "Oh, we have to keep trying to phone them, keep trying to get through to them." And these younger guys were like, "Are you serious? Like they're brainwashed." This was just after Bucha, do you know? And she was all torn around psychologically, right? Imagine your entire life you've believed in this idea that you are this brotherly nation of that Russia's your big brother, and you've got all these, particularly in Odessa, people were in the Navy, they would go to Moscow frequently, and you have this idea really hammered in, and you probably sacrifice a lot for that, believing in that. Can you turn around suddenly overnight and just let all the Jenga blocks collapse in the back of your head and say, okay, all of it was shit? I think some people did, some people do, and some people quite understandably need a bit of time.
So I was going to sort of round off with sort of the overview of the views of Ukrainians today
Mm-hmm.
on a few issues that you'll find on the ground. What is the Ukrainian view of basically, very much a believer in supporting Ukraine till the end, supplying them with weapons or everything like that. But I always sort of think of, say, Western support for the regime in Afghanistan, and then it just kind of collapsing because there wasn't the will there to say fight the Taliban the way that we assumed in our heads and made all this big policy to based on that assumption. And so something I often wrestle with is like we have all these Western efforts to create a reassurance force, supply weapons, everything like that, all based on the assumption that Ukrainians want to continue to fight as long as possible. And so one thing I'm curious is about what is Ukrainians' view on continuing the war until what kind of resolution?
I think this is a question that often gets misinterpreted through bad polling. And as a sociologist by training, it really narks me when people phrase questions badly in questionnaires and polls, and they almost always do. So if you give people this kind of binary choice, of like, should we fight on until we get everything back, including Crimea? Fewer and fewer people, of course, are going to say that, because no one talks about. I don't hear people talking about victory in the way that they used to. I don't hear Zelensky using that word for quite a long time now. And I think a lot of people understand that Crimea has been gone for a while and one day will be Ukrainian again because it is Ukrainian. But right now, it's a very different thing to say we should fight until we get Crimea than to say, yes, I want a negotiated settlement, but we need Donetsk and Luhansk, right? And I think when it comes to kind of the ceasefire, the proposals, what's on the table, I mean, there are no ceasefire negotiations. None, because Russia comes with ultimatums, with completely absurd. So I really want people to understand like the geography of Ukraine and what they are demanding. The Russian Federation annexed 4 oblasts: Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, and they do not fully occupy those at all. They don't even have the city of Zaporizhia, and they do not have the city of Kherson, though they pummel it with drones every single day. They are demanding, because those are now Russian territories by their law, they are demanding in any negotiation that they get all of those completely. And that means handing over cities of hundreds of thousands of people to a Russian occupation. There's no country in the world that would accept that, and Ukrainians certainly won't. So it really depends how you phrase the question. And I think then these polling, many more Ukrainians just want an immediate end to the war, and they're willing to have territorial concessions. That can be interpreted in so many different ways. And I think we should just be careful about the actual questions that are being asked. Of course, there has been a decrease in the number of people with an absolute hard line, fight till Crimea position, because it's been 3.5 years and their lives are so horribly messed up. There was a poll recently about how people have been affected. A quarter of people who responded in Ukraine had survived the death of a loved one, and more than a third had experienced shelling and explosions. So, yeah, the level of trauma in that society is so absolutely enormous. But they all do understand that it's an existential thing. If they're pushed into a bad deal, that will be a lasting peace.
This question sort of came up where I got into a back and forth with a friend who I thought was normal, and then he's kind of been spending like a lot of time on X, and so he was sort of talking about we sort of got into a back and forth about Ukraine, and he was sort of saying this was just before Trump had been inaugurated and stuff, and his argument was Ukraine's not going to win, and actually I'm a terrible person for insisting Ukrainians continue to fight, because they are suffering all this death, all this destruction, and actually it's I'm the immoral one for sort of
sacrificing them
yeah
on the NATO altar.
Yeah, and it's like, and so that's why I'm interested in this question of like, because someone like me is not in Ukraine, is sort of hundreds, thousands of miles from Ukraine. It's is it all right for me to say, yeah, let's help them to defeat those bloody Russians till the end, but then actually people on the ground don't feel that, and so that's a question that I'm always sort of struggling with.
Sure, I mean, just the polling data doesn't reflect that reality. Like, people in Ukraine do want to continue. There are fewer people who want to go right into keep going until we get Crimea, because they recognise that's a currently almost a strategically impossible thing. But they're certainly not saying, I want to give up now and give up, hand over Zaporizhia city and hand over Kherson. No, I don't think anyone's saying that. This argument about, how, how many more Ukrainians have to suffer, I find it one of the most like morally revolting things I've ever heard, and I would challenge those people to have the guts to say that to Ukrainian people and see what they get in response. They use them as pawns, and particularly find this with people who have a kind of that sort of lazy pacifism where you've never actually given it much thought. You just feel like very morally superior, saying, "Oh, I don't like war," and I don't like war. It's disgusting. I've seen it. It's horrible. But this kind of default position of like war is bad, therefore you should stop fighting. And I think people should understand and be honest about what that really means. It means, therefore, you should live under occupation. Russian occupation, and we know what that looks like unless they've been covering their eyes and refusing to watch the news, the mass graves, the torture cells. We know what that looks like. Is that what they're advocating? Because if you say they should stop fighting, that's what you're advocating. And I think that's so revolting.
Another thing I'm kind of interested in is like, obviously, depending how and when it ends, but sort of what sort of post-war politics will be like in Ukraine. I touched on this with Christopher Miller of like, in the West, we'll see Zelensky on the world stage, Zelensky sort of meeting the king, or the Oval Office meeting and everything like that. And so we have an idea of Zelensky as this, some people call it, modern day Churchill, and then sort of Christopher Miller was talking about how actually he's not that good of a politician. And actually, there's, he's disliked by a lot of people in Ukraine, and there's a lot of jockeying in Ukraine right now to try and succeed him. And so that's another thing I'm interested in of like the image of what we see of Ukraine, and then what is actually happening on the ground.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, as we said, Ukraine is a big country. It has a functioning government. It has its own politics. Those politics are complex and knotty. I mean, Zelensky's approval ratings are still above 50%, which is extraordinary after years of war. I don't know if you'd say he's a good politician. He's a very good wartime leader, and I think even people I know who are critical of him would be the first to admit that. The fact that he didn't leave, the fact that he remained, he'd do those sort of calm and reassuring videos explaining what's happening. We're still here. That was so important for Ukrainians. But yeah, I mean, people are talking about elections. I think it'd be very difficult. And in terms of what Ukraine looks like politically after the war, I've no idea because, as I said, they're a functioning democracy, and they'll choose someone different, I imagine. Ukrainians do have a very forthright position on getting rid of politicians they don't like, as they're always telling me, and that's a big thing for them, for their identity. So I'm sure they will create a thriving political situation after this. But obviously, post-war has a huge number of challenges. Huge. I mean, it's a strange war because reconstruction is already happening during conflict, because Russia fires on cities with impunity, making that extremely difficult. One of my worries is that the reconstruction of Ukraine will be very top-down corporate thing. You can see stuff like that with like reconstruction proposals in Kharkiv, where Norman Foster is slated to be on this group that would rebuild Kharkiv. I mean, haven't they suffered enough? The city is architecturally so unique and so extraordinary. And the idea that you'd have this sort of generic glass crap that you see in every single city in the world, and it would just look like the city of London, is just, I mean, it's the most depressing thing I can imagine. So I think Ukrainians will have a fight on their hands to retain their own sovereignty in that respect, which seems cruel given the fight they have to retain their own sovereignty right now.
And I thought I'd end with what do you hope to see, like, say, over the next 6 months?
What do I hope to see? I mean, I'd love to see this shit come to an end. I'd love to see my friends go to sleep and have a peaceful night more than anything. What do I actually hope realistically to happen? I hope that Europe gets its act together. I hope that Trump is the kick up the arse for Europe, and particularly Western Europe. I think Eastern Europe fully understands the threat and has been shouting about it for a long time, and we've been completely ignoring them. And that's part of the problem. I think that's why the European project has become so shaky, is the dominance of Western countries, and that needs to end. And my hope is there can be a kind of Czechia, Poland, Scandi-led revival of a robust Europe that takes defence seriously. And we've seen signs of that. But I don't think that's going to come from like France and Germany. I just don't. I mean, look at this stuff with the Patriots. Oh yeah, we're going to send like maybe we're going to send this stuff, in a few months, maybe a year. I mean, it's been 3.5 years. Like that's just nonsense. So yeah, those are my hopes. Is that and then obviously Ukraine should be an EU member. It should also be a NATO member. Yeah, one can hope.
Are you going back anytime soon?
No, I've just got back, so I've got lots and lots of book stuff in the next few weeks, next few months. So I'll be at the Edinburgh Book Festival, Nairn, Hereford, a few others, and then in October I will probably go back to Ukraine. I might also do a bit of an epic reporting trip, hopefully with a camper van. If anyone wants to sell me a cheap, and I mean really cheap camper van, through Eastern Europe. So I'm very interested in the kind of, I'm always interested in narratives and identity and who people think they are and how that shifts with the kind of political situation. And in Moldova, that's incredibly live as an issue. Do people feel like Moldovans? Do they feel closer to Russia? A lot of younger Moldovans now saying, well, this was always a Stalinist construct and we should be part of Romania and that would be more safe. These things, like all these live issues are shifting so much and they have such massive implications. And also, I mean, the war is already in, they're building defensive lines in these countries. So, and stuff happening in Serbia, in Kosovo. So I really want to dig into all of that by roaming around in a van. Those are my plans, such as they are. And of course, I'll be going back to Ukraine. Yeah, because I like to go back as much as I can.
Jen Stout, thank you very much.
My pleasure.